We are joined by Dr. Pradeep Thaneja, Senior Lecturer in Asian Studies at the University of Melbourne. Dr. Thaneja, thank you for making the time to speak with us. Let's start with, is this threat of higher tariffs really about India's Russian oil purchases?
Well, according to the White House, it is. And the White House has often criticized India for buying oil from Russia. And it is true that since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, India's purchases of Russian oil have increased. And it's really, when you look at the facts, the fact is that India is one of the largest importers of oil and energy more broadly. And Russian energy is available to India at a much lower price than the international market price. So from India's point of view, it is, India needs to import energy, particularly oil, and Russian oil is available at a cheaper price. So India has been saying for the last 3 years that India will continue to buy oil from Russia.
How do you assess the Trump administration framing this as an issue tied to the war in Ukraine?
Well, President Trump himself hasn't done a great deal to try and stop this war. And now, of course, he's blaming countries like India for importing oil from Russia. But as Indian government issued a statement yesterday, and in its statement, Indian government has pointed out that the United States is still importing commodities from Russia. Europe, of course, the European Union has also imposed sanctions against other countries for importing energy from Russia, but the European Union itself has been importing oil and oil products from Russia. So India has said that, look, it's not about anything else. It's about interest, and India's economic interests are served well by importing oil from whoever is willing to supply oil to India at a reasonable price. So Indian government has really made its position very clear by issuing that statement which focuses on energy imports and said that this is not about condoning Russia's actions in Ukraine. This is not about human rights. This is pure and simple about market economics and India's interests.
India is standing firm, as you said, against these U.S. accusations. But should it be concerned by the prospect of higher U.S. tariffs? I mean, what kind of impact could this have on Indian exporters?
I mean, certainly there are Indian businesses who are concerned about the consequences of these extra tariffs. And interestingly, President Trump hasn't said exactly what these additional tariffs will be, which to me implies that President Trump is still hoping for negotiations with India and to try and reach some sort of agreement. So I don't think this is the final word. I think we're going to see negotiations between India and the White House, the U.S. administration. Remember that over the last few weeks, we have seen reports that India has significantly increased, in fact, more than doubled imports of American crude. So India is trying to send a signal to Washington that we don't just buy oil from Russia, we buy it from nearly 40 different countries. And India has been increasing its own sort of imports of oil, crude oil, from the United States also. So I think India is trying to argue that we are buying from a diversity of sources, including the United States, and we are willing to increase our imports of oil from the US. So I think there is still room for maneuver. I think there is room for negotiations. And I have a feeling that we are going to see a more positive outcome.
You seem very optimistic about these potential negotiations. India was one of the first countries to begin trade talks with the US. Why has it been so difficult, or why is it taking them so long to reach an agreement?
One of the more difficult issues in the trade negotiations between the US and India has been agricultural products. India's economy, agriculture's role is about only 14% of India's GDP, and more than 50% of India's workforce is engaged in agriculture. Now, Indian government is very sensitive to the needs of some of the poorest sections of India's community, which is farmers, particularly farmers with very small land holdings or no land holdings at all. So Indian government is trying to protect the interest of some of the poorest people in the world. And therefore, India has been reluctant to open up its markets to American agricultural goods. And that's where I think most of the difficult parts of the negotiations have been.
So then do you think that India will have to give in to the U.S. for a deal to be reached?
I think India can't afford to give in to the US demand. And therefore, the negotiations with the United States are going to emphasize not only just trade, not only economic relationship, but the broader strategic relationship. And remember that over the last 20 years, US India strategic relationship has grown tremendously. India is a very important partner for the United States, particularly when it comes to the security situation in the Indo-Pacific, with the rise of China, with China's very aggressive posture in the Indo-Pacific region. India is almost an indispensable security partner to the United States. And I think officials in India would be hoping that those in the US administration who understand the security dynamics and the role that India can play would try and influence President Trump to moderate his demands on India.
Dr. Thaneja, it kind of appears that the U.S. and India are at an impasse at this point. Do you think this ongoing trade tussle could possibly push India closer to Russia then?
Well, India already has, as you know, India has a long-standing, close relationship with Russia, which extends beyond trade. In fact, the strategic relationship with Russia is very important to India's own security. India still buys considerable amount of its military hardware from Russia, although India now buys a lot more, it seems, from the US and other Western allies. But this impasse is not going to be resolved purely by focusing on tariffs. I think US has to take the bigger picture in view in dealing with India. India is not a small country that you could push around. India is the world's fifth largest economy. It is aiming to be the third largest economy in the world. It is a very important security partner for the United States and other Western allies in the Indo-Pacific region. So I have a feeling that we are going to see more. That this is not the end of it. We're going to see negotiations, perhaps with people who are much more attuned to the security role that India plays in the region. And bilateral relationship between the United States and India is not just about trade. It is also about security. It is also about people-to-people relations. U.S. has a very large Indian diaspora. Many members of the Indian diaspora are at the peak of American business and medicine and many other professions. And I have a feeling that we are going to see more people involved in this discussion.
You mentioned that it's not just about trade. Security plays a role as well. We've seen in the past few months, President Trump and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, they had very good relations. So what caused this shift, and could this rift be temporary?
Well, Prime Minister Modi was one of the first foreign leaders to travel in February to Washington to meet with President Trump, to get in early and try and protect India's interests. President Trump's position has been fluctuating, every day. He comes up with a different rate of tariff for other countries, and India has been thrown into that mix. But ultimately, I think if a deal is to be struck between India and the United States, it has to be based on a more comprehensive relationship, not just focus on tariffs. And I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that somehow the U.S. administration would realize that India is too important a partner to simply be antagonized just because of this obsession with tariffs that President Trump has.
Thank you, Dr. Thaneja, for sharing your insights with us. We were speaking to Dr. Pradeep Thaneja, Senior Lecturer in Asian Studies at the University of Melbourne.